Hello and welcome once again to another episode of Ghettofabulous Kings of War. Today we are going to talk about 3rd edition's Goblin Army list. We'll have to go a little bit over the game itself, some of the changes. We'll make a separate video to focus on the changes in the rules for 3rd specifically, but we'll have to talk about it a little bit in relation to the Goblin Army. Bottom line up front, for those who don't want to sit through everything, I would say the Goblin Army is kind of a lateral move, maybe some slight improvements overall. The same general types of armies I think you could take in the past, whether you wanted a combined arms thing, kind of a melee, flood the zone, grindy kind of focus thing, or a heavy shooting list. You can still probably get those out of this army. And in fact, I think a few of the units have been increased so that there may be another option or two, maybe kind of a mobile cavalry type list, because I think the cavalry has been increased or improved a little bit now too. So, yeah, overall, slight improvement, a few more options. So I think in general, it's a good thing for the goblins. They didn't get hit or nerfed hard or anything. Starting off, the army rule from last edition, Yellow Belly, is now gone. Instead, and this is a good thing from a gameplay perspective, for fluff wise and stuff, it was kind of a neat rule. It was kind of fun. It added that unpredictability to the army, but from a gameplay perspective, it's many units in the Goblin army didn't have the rule. It was too easy to forget to roll for it, or maybe you remember to turn later or at 2 turns later, and what do? Roll and go back, undo stuff. It's just clunky from a gameplay perspective. So it's good to get rid of it. Maybe instead, if they had done Yellow Belly and had everything have lower nerve, which, yeah, the Goblin army does have low nerve to begin with anyway. What they replaced it with was Maw Pups, which basically is for melee focused goblins, not trolls or anything, but melee focused goblin units for 10 points can get a one-time use of a 6 attacks, hitting on 4s, unmodified, I believe, with crushing 1. It's kind of like a brutal plus, I guess, because you're only going to get 1 or 2 wounds out of it, but they're actual wounds instead of just the brutal modifier. So it's good. I mean, it's a nice thing to have. It's a little disappointing because when you look at the other armies, like the elves, they have some kind of cat that gives that gives their units duelists, but only a few units can take it. The ogres, I think, get like croco dogs. It's an upgrade that lets them do some kind of melee thing. I just saw a sneak peek at the upcoming salamanders, and they get flame effigy or something, which gives them kind of a one-time vicious use thing. I don't know. It seems very samey, and that was a complaint from the early days of Kings of War that, unlike, say, Warhammer Fantasy, where armies and units were very different, things, at least, especially for new players looking at it, you're like, well, what's the difference between a human spear unit and a elf spear unit? They look pretty much the same. Well, the elves have elite, they're speed 6, and those changes do actually play out quite a bit on the table. So maybe I'm overreacting, but it just kind of seems like every army is getting very similar type special rules. And the weird thing is, like in the elves, most of their units still have elite, but I don't think they list elite as part of the special rule. The special rule is this cat thing. Put elite in there, especially for newer players. It just kind of shows them that, hey, a lot of your units are going to have elite. More units have elite than I think can take the battle cat things. So, I don't know. Overall, at least for the goblins, the army rule is good. The general trend in the armor rules does not excite me very much, but it is what it is. For units themselves, starting with the regular old infantry guys, Sharpsticks, Rabble, they're almost identical. The only difference is, from previous edition, that legions are now worth 4 unit strength, as opposed to, I think last edition they were the same as hordes at 3 unit strength. So that's, I guess, an improvement. The big question really is going to be, is this edition going to... Sharpsticks weren't, or phalanx in general last edition was not really worth taking. considering the increase in price for the units that had it. And of course, the big discussion now is with the rules change, with the increase in what Phalanx gives units, will we see more of it in the future? If I were going to go to a tournament right now and with 3rd edition rules, I would not invest heavily in sharp sticks. I still would go with the rabble, hordes or legions maybe. Actually, in my army, I'd probably have a horde and 2 regiments, just like I had before, just because they're utilitarian, and the horde can take a charge from most units, even if they are cavalry. They get enough nerve. I still don't see the sharp sticks being worth it. But if the meta changes to such an extent that, yeah, there's lots of flying stuff and cavalry around, then maybe it will be worth it. So I don't think they're necessarily unplayable. I still just have doubts that it's going to change much from last edition. Spitters. Spitters are the same from 2019's Clash of Kings. They're regular. The only difference is they are 20 points more expensive. So that's in line with the general trend you see across the rule book for 3rd edition. Shooting is trying to be, at least units shooting, is trying to be toned down. So most shooting units are irregular. Most shooty units, not artillery, but actual units that shoot, have either gone up in price, or like with mounted units, have had their range reduced. So towards the end of Clash of Kings 2019, I didn't see a lot of spitters out there. Goblin armies that were shooty seemed to focus on artillery a lot more. And while the artillery has changed a bit, I don't think it's... In fact, in some ways, I think it's been an improvement for Goblins. So I think shooty army lists that I saw that relied mostly on artillery are still going to be viable. I didn't see spitters much towards the end of 2019, and with the increase in cost and the other nerfs to shooting, I think you'll see them even less. So that's what that is. The big change, or actually it's not a change, but the first thing where you'll see some options open up for Goblin players is with the trolls, large infantry. Trolls themselves have changed barely at all. The only difference is that I can see is that the regiment of trolls is 10 points cheaper. Probably because 2 things. Now regiments of large infantry don't unlock anything, so they've lost that. And no one really took troll regiments in the past because I don't know why you would. I don't know what they accomplish for you. If you're trying to get check, there's better options. If you want a cheap unit to kind of help out in a multi-charge or contribute, you're probably better off with a Mincer or something. So they just didn't have a role. No one took them. The discount of 10 points and the fact that they don't unlock, you're still not going to see them, I don't think. Troll hordes, however, were very common and very popular because they're a great unit. And I think in the past, the only thing they really competed with for the same general role. They're kind of tough. They're not super tanky or tar pity, but they're kind of tough, and they hit kind of hard because of their poor nerve. You had to put a lot of items on them to get the most out of them. They're not super killers, but they hit okay. Previous edition, they seemed to kind of compete with giants, and that was about it. Now, there's 2 units that are similar or similar-ish. The first is the leggets. Leggets, if you're unaware, are kind of like, I guess, buff goblins that have 2-handed weapons. They come in troops and regiments. And just for comparative purposes, if you're looking to kind of fill the same role as a troll horde, you're going to be looking at a regiment of leggets. So the leggets are... A regiment is 160 points, as opposed to the horde of trolls, which is 190. The leggets have crushing 1 instead of crushing 2, but they do have brutal, so that gives them a slight bonus in melee. They also have 20 attacks instead of 18 for the troll horde, and they have wild charge D3. So they're speed 5 because they're just goblins, but with the wild charge, they can charge an inch shorter or up to an inch further than the trolls. That unpredictability is kind of handy, I suppose, because your opponent has to plan for the worst and stay out of range. They can also take mop-ups. That's 10 points, but that gives them at least a one-time use of 6 additional crushing 1 attacks. So, and the regiment is unit strength 3, just like the troll horde. And the infantry, because infantry regiment, it unlocks, I don't believe it's exactly the same, but it's similar to the troll horde. So I look at this, I think, because first of all, they're kind of neat. The Vanguard models for Leggets are actually very nice looking. They're kind of a neat unit. I think you're going to see some of these guys at the beginning of 3rd edition. People are going to try them out. The regiments, I don't know, for just a few more points, I think trolls are just better. They hit basically the same. They're much tougher. The Leggets are only defense 4, while the trolls are defense 5. The Leggets are dash 15 nerve, while the trolls are 14-17. So you'd think at least the fearless part may be kind of handy, but as we'll see later on, there's now basically an item that gives a character a 6-inch radius aura of headstrong. So when trolls in the past had problems with nerve, a individual running around with this aura of headstrong suddenly fixes that problem. And the second problem trolls had was, while they hit okay, they don't hit really hard. And they had to take items to negate their poor nerve so they wouldn't get wavered all the time. Well, now you've got a character that can take an aura to keep them headstrong, that negates the nerve issue pretty well. And now they can start taking items to make them more punchy, which solves the second problem. So I don't see the need or the role being filled well for Leggets. I think just a troll horde fills it. The Legget troop, it's 105 points, 15 attacks still, hitting on 4s, crushing 1, and they're dash 11 nerve. Maybe people might try these out and get a little more success out of them. They're relatively cheap. You have a couple of these units running around. They hit, pretty hard for 105 points. And again, with dash 11 nerve, they're fearless. They're a little, at least for me, a little expensive for chaff. If you want chaff, you're just going to run a rabble regiment or something. It's tougher and cheaper. But this unit can actually attack things and do well. So I could see them kind of being scattered around just to contribute to combats and help you get those few extra wounds to win. The other unit that's going to compete with trolls, and I think probably more successfully, is the Mincer mob. And that's was introduced in Clash of Kings 2019. When it first came out, people were excited about it. They played around with them for a little bit. They're a neat unit. They're okay, but they just weren't for the point cost invested. There were better options out there, so you kind of quickly saw them fall to the wayside. At least I did. I saw a lot at the beginning. Towards the end of 2019, there were a couple people who'd play around with them, but they were not the best choice. Now, however, we'll take a look. So, compared to Clash of Kings 2019, first of all, you have options now. You can take a troop, which is basically 2 Mincers next to each other, or you can take a regiment, which, like Clash of Kings 2019, is 3 Mincers next to each other. We'll compare regiments to regiments just to give you an idea of kind of how they stand. The old Mincer Mob Regiment from last edition cost 220 points. The new Mincer Regiment costs 200 points. 20-point discount is nice. The previous editions was 14-16 nerve. The new one is dash 16 nerve. So you've got a 20-point price reduction, and now it's fearless. The last edition was D6 plus 24 attacks. The new one is D6 plus 21 attacks. So you lose 3 attacks, but everything else is the same. So ultimately, I think this is a win. This is a substantial upgrade for the Mincer Mob. It punches a little bit less, but it's cheaper, it's fearless, it's an upgrade overall. Now, 200 points for its unit strength 2 in a regiment, compared to 190 points for the Troll Horde. Now you can see where, okay, the Mincer Mobs are regular, so you needed something to unlock, so you might take some Trolls. But instead of a second or third troll horde, a Mincer mob is appealing. It's big shield, so it's better armor. Shooting is probably going to be less prevalent, so maybe you don't have to worry quite so much about plink damage and regenerating it off. Dash 16 nerve is comparable and probably better overall than the 14-17 nerve that the trolls have. And D6 plus 21 attacks, crushing 1, thunders 1, hitting on 4s. You're talking, what, 24 attacks average and brutal. 24 attacks compared to 18 attacks. So it's going to hit harder. And with the increased number of attacks, it gets more benefit out of things like Bane Chant. Yeah. The only negative really is it's speed 5, where the trolls are speed 6. But it's something very, I think people will have to consider very carefully, and I think you'll see Mincer regiments a lot more. The other option is the troop, and I didn't write down the stats here. Obviously, because only 2 Mincers instead of 3, it's reduced number of attacks, reduced nerve. The cost is 160. So again, and because it's now 2 Mincers next to each other, it's 100 millimeter frontage. It's a little narrower, a little easier to move around. Yeah, maybe people will, instead of putting a whole mob in, you have one or two of those Mincer troops in the back, and again, they can kind of contribute to a multi-charge and throw in a couple extra wounds to push something over the limit in melee. So yeah, I think you're going to see a lot of experimentation with both, and yeah, I think regiments are going to be competing. Instead of armies with like 3 troll hordes, you might see 2 troll hordes and a Mincer mob. On to the cavalry. Sniffs. Sniffs, in line with all the other mobile archers in the game now. They've had their bows reduced from 24-inch range to 18-inch range, and they are irregular. And they've had a price increase. They've gone from a regiment, again, I like to focus on the bigger units. The regiment's gone from 145 points to 160 points. So, 15-point increase, they're irregular, and 6-inch range reduction. But it's not all negative. They get vicious now in melee, which you're probably thinking, so what? I don't want them in melee anyway. They've gone from a 5+ to hit to a 4+ to hit in melee. And suddenly you're thinking, well, that's actually, it's not ideal, but it's not that bad. Really, even last edition, the way shooting worked, the sniffs weren't putting out that many wounds. And because they're speed 10 and nimble, they're usually working the flanks anyway. They've got a lot of opportunities to open up for flank charges. But because their melee was so lame, it wasn't really a serious concern for opponents. You might commit them to a charge, a combination charge, just to add a few extra wounds onto something, but they weren't gonna break something. But now, a regiment has got 14 attacks. If you flank charge with that into a defense 4 unit, 28 attacks, 14 hits. With vicious, you're talking 8 or 9 wounds. That's pretty significant. That's something that has to be considered, and your opponent can't just ignore them anymore. That has to be something they're concerned with. With the new hill rules, suddenly they can get Thunderous 1 if they charge off a hill. The Goblins have access to Bane Chant. There's all sorts of possibilities now. So it's not something that can be ignored anymore, and it gives Goblins a lot more flexibility, which is also nice because I think there's going to be a little bit more things that prevent you from shooting as effectively. Not just the cover rules. I think Night Stalkers are going to be more prevalent, at least initially. They got some nice new models. Mantic's pushing them. And I think there's just a little more access to stealthy throughout the game. So having that option now, they can charge in and actually do some damage, gives you a little bit more flexibility. Speaking of flexibility and improving cavalry, the Fleabag Riders A similar story. They got slightly more expensive. I didn't actually write down the amount. I think it maybe 10 points for a regiment, 15 points or something. But they've kind of gone the same direction as Clash of Kings 2019 did, where now 2019 you could get a formation and they would lose yellow belly and they get vicious. Well, the whole army has lost yellow belly and now base fleabag riders and pretty much anything that's got to do with a mob beast, like the sniffs, like chariots, like the mob beast packs, are all vicious now. So fleabag riders are vicious base, which is great. That really does add a lot to their punch. They've got slightly better unit strength too. The troops are still 1 unit strength, but the regiments are 3 unit strength instead of 2 from last edition, and the horde is 4 unit strength as opposed to 3. And I think, again, with the new hill rules, with Bane Chant, with Vicious, you might actually want to consider using a horde of these guys. They put out a significant amount of damage for their point cost. They've got great mobility. Regiments were already pretty common and pretty effective. This just makes them much more effective. Again, for a slight point increase, you get unit strength bonus and vicious, and they can take mob pups as well. So on the charge, you can throw in, again, another 6 attacks hitting on 4s with crushing 1, another point or 2 of damage, and you're increasing a couple wounds because of vicious as well. They're going to be much more effective. So, yes, you're going to see more mob beast or fleabag riders potentially, because there are, just like the trolls, I think 2 units that kind of compete for the same spot, not quite as successfully, and they're a little more different than the 2 units who are competing with the trolls. The first of which, flipping my little notepad over here, is the Maw Beast pack. Now, the Maw Beast pack went through a lot of changes over the course of 2nd edition. At the very beginning of 2nd edition, you would see potentially quite a few Maw Beast packs in armies. They were irregular, which was irritating because they didn't unlock anything. But I think there were 95 points for a regiment, 12 attacks, crushing 1, vicious, hitting on 3s, speed 6, and nimble. The only problem was they were defense 3 and 12-14 Irv, like most Goblin regiments. So they're a little soft, a little squishy, but speed 6 nimble, they could move around a little bit, and 12 attacks hitting on 3s, crushing 1 vicious. For their points, for 95 points, they put out quite a bit of damage. Very quickly, after seeing some armies spamming Maw Beast packs, it got changed to everything else was the same, but they hit on 4s instead of 3s. Well, suddenly at 95 points, that's not very good. That's not worth it. And then they went from seeing them all over the place to not seeing them at all. And they kind of languished, not being picked through the end of 2nd edition. Well, they've tried to go back to the original concept of hitting on 3s. And they gave them Wild Charge D3, so now they can charge quite a bit more. The speed 6 still, so 12 inches plus 1 to 3, so 13 to 15 inch charge range. However, the problem is a regiment costs 120 points. Now, one of them you can upgrade for 10 points. You can upgrade one of these packs to have defense 4 and be a regular cavalry regiment, which grants unlocks. So, for our comparison purposes, let's compare an upgraded regiment of Maw Beasts to a regiment of Fleabag Riders. So 130 points versus 155 points. The Maw Beast pack is speed 6 with nimble. The Riders are speed 10 with nimble. So huge advantage to the Fleabag Riders. Crushing 1 versus Thunderous 1. Okay, Crushing 1 is slightly better. Defense for both is going to be 4. The height on the the Maw Beast is only height 2. They're the same as regular infantry, while the cavalry is height 3. I think, I mean, in some ways you might say the smaller height is better because you can hide them behind things and get them cover from shooting. But ultimately, I think the increase in height is the bonus, especially with the Fleabag Riders' height or their mobility and nimble. They get to capitalize on a lot more charge opportunities because of the height. So that's, I think, a negative ultimately for the Maw Beast pack. 12 attacks on 3s versus 14 attacks on 4s is a slight edge to the Maw Beast pack. But ultimately, I don't. What would you use these guys for? They're not fast enough, and especially if they're upgraded, they're defense 3. They're not tough enough to kind of operate on the flanks on their own. They're going to just get shot up or crushed, or they're too slow to really work around the flanks that much. They hit okay, but for 120 or 130 points, you could probably get something that hits better. In fact, like a second line, something hits your opponent, charges a rabble or some chaff you've got up front, and these guys are the second line to countercharge for 120 or 130 points. I mean, at that point, maybe you're looking at, again, those leggets. For 105 points, you get a troop of them. 15 attacks, hitting on 4, crushing 1 brutal. Defense 4, dash 11 nerve. So not quite as high nerve, but they're fearless, and they're defense 4. I don't know. I just don't. And those are cheaper, 105 points for the troop. So I don't see a real role for these units. They're fluffy, they're kind of cool, but I think they're better options. The other direction you could head is with the Chariots. Just like the Sniffs and mobile cavalry or shooty cavalry has changed quite a bit, Chariots have changed significantly in 3rd edition. And they have shooting, but their shooting has been reduced pretty significantly. So I think of them more as a melee unit, which is why they compete with Fleabag Riders. So you can get them in troops, regiments, hordes, or legions. In the footprints, I think, as I recall, you didn't see Chariots much in last edition, but I believe they are slightly different than you saw in the past. Before, I think all you saw were regiments and hordes. The troops and legions is different. So a troop is basically 2 chariots next to each other, so 100 by 100 square. The regiment is 3 in a row. The horde is 4 chariots in a row. So that's a 200 millimeter frontage and 100 deep. That's a major drawback, I think. I think I think they're trying to increase the usage of chariots, but that frontage is so huge, I think that's going to turn a lot of people off from the hordes. The Legion is actually 2 regiments back to back, so it's actually 150 millimeters across the front, or 3 chariots across the front, and then 200 millimeters deep, two chariots deep. And that's not too unwieldy. That's not too difficult to move around, I don't think. Since we're kind of competing or comparing with the Fleabag Riders, what we'll do is we'll look. Oh, the other thing I'll say is shooting. So chariots in the past had the same number of melee attacks as they did shooting attacks. They were ranged 5, so 5 ups to hit, and they weren't nimble, so they just took the penalty. So what you saw most of the time with chariots is they didn't move much. They would just stand and shoot until the enemy got really close, and then they would just charge. I think Mantic did the right thing to try to make them interesting. Chariots are supposed to be mobile. That's what makes them fun. So they gave them steady aim. They're not nimble, but they have steady aim, so they can move and shoot without penalty. So that kind of gets the game more dynamic. It's not just static and boring. But they reduced substantially the number of shots for these units. So while the regiment, for example, has 12 melee attacks, it only has 6 shooting attacks. The Legion has 20 attacks in melee, but it's only got 10 attacks shooting. And even with steady aim, hitting on 5s, no piercing or anything, it's so minimal. It's to be trivial. I don't think anyone's going to rely on the shooting. It's going to be kind of an afterthought. And in fact, if I were playing a game and I was getting kind of low on time in a tournament or an event, it'd be something I'd be seriously considering skipping. These guys are going to be focused on melee and not shooting. So let's compare a regiment of Fleabag Chariots to a regiment of Fleabag Riders. In fact, they're the same exact cost, which is kind of interesting. The Chariots are speed 9, while the regular Fleabags are speed 10 and nimble. The Chariots have 12 attacks, while the Fleabags have 14 attacks. But the Chariots are Thunderous 2 with Vicious, while the Fleabag Riders are Thunderous 1 with Vicious. The Regiment of Chariots is only unit strength 2, while the Fleabags are unit strength 3. The Fleabag Riders, the Riders can take Maw Pups, while the Chariots cannot. Like I said at the beginning, Goblin units that are kind of melee focused can take the Maw Pups. And Chariots, because they have bows, apparently are not melee focused enough. So they don't have that ability. They're both height 3. They're both 12, 14 nerve. So when you look at these, I mean, yeah, they're Thunderous 2, but they're only 12 attacks. They're speed 9 to speed 10 nimble. And less unit strength. And they're irregular as well, looking at the book there. So I don't know why you would take a regiment of Chariots over a regiment of Fleabag Riders. The tiny bit of additional shooting is not worth it. And, okay, they're Thunderous 2, but realistically, with 2 extra attacks, and if you spend 10 points and get the Maw Pups, I think the Fleabag Riders are going to be comparable in damage output. So I don't think that's worth it. We can also compare a legion of Chariots to a horde of Fleabag Riders. And I think this is where it gets a little more interesting. Again, speed 9 to speed 10 nimble. The Legion of Chariots is 225 points, while the horde of Fleabag Riders is 265. The Legion of Chariots has 20 attacks at Thunderous 2, hitting on 4s, while the horde of Cavalry is 28 attacks, Thunderous 1. They're both vicious. They're both unit strength 4. So, the Legion of Chariots is 17-19 nerve. The horde of Cavalry is 19-21. So, I mean, 8 more attacks, a little faster, 2 points more nerve, but it is 40 points more. Is the 40 points worth it? I mean, the nimble is kind of handy, but if you're not having this in the back line, if it's not trying to run up a flank and get around, if it's just going to charge up front, you know, it's kind of between the flank and the middle of your army. It's on the edge, in that middle zone there. Maybe nimble isn't so important. And with that, for 225 points, that hits reasonably hard. And it's got 10 ranged attacks. Again, not anything incredible, but 10 attacks is going to cause a wound or two. You need something maybe to plink away at chaff. So I think some of these larger units of Chariots might be worth considering. Instead of the smaller units, you're either going to go with, I think, a Fleabag Riders, if you're looking at something mobile to get around and fight, or if you're looking for something to kind of help out with counter-punching, you're going to be looking at Mincers, maybe the Legget troop, something like that. Let's see, what else do we got? Looks like next up is shooting, artillery, in point of fact. While the game in general seems to have tried to nerf shooting or reduce it, Goblin shooting in the past seemed, at least towards the end of 2nd edition, seemed to focus a lot on artillery. And artillery has not changed much. And in fact, I think it may have gotten better for goblins. Um, let's take a look at the rock thrower, everyone's favorite. Compared to last edition, the rock thrower last edition was 80 points. It's now 90 points. But it does get +1 nerve for some strange reason. So, I mean, it's not just a meaningless nerfing point increase. It does, you get a point nerve out of it, which is good. What I think is more interesting is instead of one attack hitting on 5, it's d6 plus 2 blast, it's 2 attacks hitting on 5s with blast d3 plus 1. So it's the same, kind of. And one of the advantages, or I saw a lot of goblin armies really rely on lots of rock throwers, and you can still have 3. My apologies. You can still have 3, but you can't have 4 because you can't. There's no like named rock lobber. So the thing that was helpful in tournaments was people would bring these goblin armies with lots of rock lobbers, but because there's so few dice rolls, there's only 1 shot per turn per each one. It was very swingy. Some games you would roll above average and absolutely destroy your opponent, but other games you'd roll below average and you've got a bunch of points invested in rock lobbers that aren't scoring because they don't have any unit strength, and they're not hitting, so they're not contributing to the fight. And then your actual scoring line troops get overrun and the game's over. So I always thought that it was tough to rely on a artillery heavy army with goblins in a tournament setting because you have to be more consistent and reliable every game. You might win a game or two and then you're going to have a bad game or two and lose them. This, you're just increasing the number of die rolls. so you're with more die rolls, things average out more. So you're going to get a more average game. I suppose in some ways that's good, but I think that makes, in some ways, it more attractive to bring more artillery as a goblin player because it's less swingy, so it's more reliable, so you can count on it more. So it's more effective to bring. That's just my thought process. And now there's a monster, which I don't like it a lot. I don't think it's ultimately going to be handy. But there's a flying monster you can take for 120 points, well, 130 with an upgrade, that you can mark an enemy unit, and then anything that's got the lobber keyword, which is the big rocks thrower, a mop-up launcher we'll talk about, and the bolt thrower, for whatever reason, it gives them elite when they shoot at that marked unit. I think a lot of people are going to try it out. I don't think it's necessarily going to be worth it, but again, it's just making the shooting for the army, the artillery shooting, more effective, I think, more reliable. The war trombone, I don't think it's changed. It's from Clash of Kings 2019. It's still 10 attacks, still 810 nerve, still 65 points, still 12-inch shooting, piercing 1. Breath weapons are gone, so it's just a shooting attack, 12-inch shooting attack with piercing. It has steady aim, so it doesn't get a penalty for moving and shooting, but now cover can apply. So it's not, I guess, ultimately as good, but it's pretty similar to what it was last edition. The sharpstick thrower, looking at my notes here, is significantly more expensive. It was 55 points. It is now 75 points. I've got my old book here, actually, just to double check. Yeah, so last edition, it hit on 5s, had 2 shots with blast D3, piercing 2. Now it hits on 4s with 2 shots, blast D3, piercing 2. So it did get more effective, but you didn't see a lot of sharpstick throwers last edition, and the reason was cover. I mean, for just a few points more, you can get a big rock thrower that hits harder, because it has higher blast, and because it's higher piercing, and it ignores cover. And you're not going to have it in your front line. You're usually going to have it in the back. So most of the time, you're going to be shooting at something in cover because your own unit's going to create the cover. I don't think the sharp stick thrower is going to change with this new edition. You're still not going to see very many of them. Yeah, okay, hits on 4s with its 2 attacks now, which is nice. I just don't. You're still going to see a lot of cover. You're not going to in front because it's going to get shot. So people are just. And now, the price difference is only 15 points. 75 points for the sharp stick thrower or 90 for the big rock thrower. Just take the big rock thrower. The mop-up launcher is also 75 points. It shoots 3 times, hitting on 4s. Blast D3, ignores cover. It's, indirect fire. It's artillery. Blast D3, but no piercing or anything. It's just 3 attacks, hitting on 4s. Blast D3. It also has the ability to target friendly units in melee. And if they have the mop-up upgrade, mop-up cages is what it's called, it's a one-use item, right? So you give it to your regiment of flea bags or whatever. They charge, they use it. Next turn, they charge again or charge a different unit. The mop-up launcher can shoot the friendly unit as long as it scores a hit, which 3 attacks hitting on 4s, ignoring cover. It's pretty likely to do. It reloads the unit's mop-up cages so they can use them in melee again. Another 6 attacks, crushing 1, hitting on 4s. It's interesting. For 75 points, however, I don't think it's really ultimately going to be worth it. People who really want a lot of artillery are probably going to try it out. Because, 3 attacks hitting on 4s, D3, blast. It'll hurt chaff and lightly armored units, but I don't think the mop-up delivery is going to ultimately be worth the points invested in it. But I could be wrong. I'm sure people will try it out. I just think it'll fade away. You won't see it very much anymore. And that's it for war engines. We'll move on to monsters. And there's 2 categories now. It used to be just monsters. Now there's monsters and titans. They're kind of similar, but titans are just bigger. I talked a bit about the Wingit. Yeah, it's fly, speed 10. It's got a weak little firebomb thing you can throw. I'm not very interested in it, so I'm not going to talk about it much. I think people are going to play around with it. I don't think it's worth it, ultimately. The Mincer, however, is one of my favorites, and I think the Mincer will continue to see good use. It's 10 points more now. It was 80 points last edition. Now it's 90. But it went from 9/11 nerf to -11 nerf, so now it's fearless, which is great. And I had mentioned, although it's kind of interesting because I had mentioned earlier about you got a character now that can have a aura of headstrong. But now a lot of units like the Mincer, like the leggets, the Mincer mobs, a lot of units are getting fearless now. So really, that headstrong is only going to be applicable to goblins, I mean actual goblins, or the trolls. So while that's a neat upgrade ability that we'll talk about, a lot of the units that it might have affected that would be around this guy with this ability are going to be fearless now. So that benefit is going away a little bit. Everything else about the Mincer is the same. And yeah, I think it's still quite worthwhile to take. The other unit is the Goblin Blaster. You didn't see them very much. They weren't in the original. Well, I take that back. I think Ogres had a Goblin Blaster from the start of 2nd edition. It got added to the Goblin army in Clash of Kings 2019. I didn't see them very much. I took some of them to a couple tournaments towards the end of 2019's run. Had hit or miss success with them, but ultimately they're kind of clunky. Especially when I think I had 3 of them in my army, so it was really hard to deploy. opponents didn't know how to handle them because they never saw them. Some games they were spectacular, other games they were terrible. They were all over the place, but they were fun. But they were also kind of complicated. And kind of like the yellow belly rule, these were just, from a rules gameplay perspective, a little awkward. The new Goblin Blaster is much more like a traditional unit. Speed 5. It has range attacks, kind of a handful of like grenades it can throw. They're not great, so it's not what it's bought for. It's defense 5, dash 10 nerve, 65 points. So in those regards, it's pretty similar to the old one. But instead of just detonating on your choice, it charges and attacks in melee as normal. It has 3 attacks, hitting on 3s, blast D6, brutal, crushing strength 3. So it can charge and do a significant, not a huge amount of damage with a frontal charge. From a flank charge, it could do some devastation. But on a frontal charge, it's what? 3 attacks hitting on 3, so 2 hits. Blast D6, so you're talking 7 hits with crushing 3. And at the end of a turn where it charges and hits something, it has to cause a wound. It's removed from play, so it still blows up. Its effects aren't as devastating, however. But for 65 points, 7-ish hits with crushing 3, it's not bad to throw in there. And now you don't have the risk of it blowing up and hurting your own stuff. If you can somehow finagle it to a flank charge and it's height 3, so it can see over your regular goblins, that 7 crushing strength 3 hits is now 14. That would be significant. So, yeah, I think you'll at least see people playing around with them. I think it's not bad to have 1 or 2 in your army list to charge into some of those higher armor defense things that may be running around, like, I don't know, vampires or earth elementals or something. That brings us to Titans. Titans are 2. There's the Giant and the Slasher. The Giant is kind of a hybrid between last edition's regular Giant and the Colossal Giant. There is no difference anymore. There's just one Giant. It is a Titan, so it's on a 75 by 75 millimeter base. We'll compare it to, it's closer, I think, to last edition's regular Giant, so we'll just compare it to that. The new Giant is 225 points, while last edition's regular Giant was 190, so 35 more points. What do you get for 35 more points? Well, you get crushing 4 instead of crushing 3. That only makes a difference if you're taking defense 6, which isn't super common, but okay, it is a upgrade. It gets D6 plus 8 attacks instead of D6 plus 6, so 2 more attacks is handy. It gets 1 more point of nerve, 1820 instead of 1719. It is on a bigger base, 75 millimeter square as opposed to 50 millimeter square, so that's a negative. Overall though, I think this unit still has a place in many armies. I don't think it's a bad thing to have. I didn't take Giants a lot at the beginning of 2nd edition. Towards the end, I actually didn't have enough units. I started adding them more to my list, and I was pleasantly surprised at how well they helped out and how effective they were. So I started adding 1 or 2 Giants quite a bit more, and not the Colossal Giants. I'm kind of a cheapskate on points. I don't like buying the big units. But I think this one is still going to be worth the points and still be effective. So you'll see this a lot more. One thing you didn't see last edition were the Slashers, because ultimately Slashers and Giants were kind of competing for the same thing. You're looking for a monster. It's smaller. It's not going to hit quite as hard as a unit, but because it's smaller, it can fit in and contribute to multi-charges, or it can maybe use its speed to work around flanks. The Goblin Slasher didn't hit quite as hard as the Giant, but you could buy a ranged attack on it, and maybe that would kind of compromise, like a Chariot. It's not as effective in melee, but it has shooting as well, so you get the best of both worlds. No one took it because it was garbage last edition, and I don't think he was going to take it this edition because it's garbage again, which is unfortunate because I think the new slasher model looks pretty cool, and people want to have options, but you're just going to take the giant every time. So what does this slasher get? Well, it's only 210 points instead of 225, so it's 15 points less. That's a bonus. What else? Let's see. Let's take a look here. The giant has D6 plus 8 attacks, hitting on 4s. This thing has 8 attacks, hitting on 3s. So, fewer attacks, hitting on 3s. Depending on the roll, I guess, for the giants, it's going to be similar. It's only crushing strength 2, whereas the giant is crushing 4. The giant has Fury, Brutal, and Strider. The slasher just has Strider. They're both speed 7. They're both defense 5. The giant's 18-20 nerve. This thing's only 16-18 nerve. And it has a sharp stick throw on its back. 36-inch range, 2 attacks hitting on 5s with steady aim, blast D3, and piercing 2. So, pretty much everything about it is worse than the giant. You save 15 points and you get a lame range attack. You're just not going to see these guys. and it's a shame because, again, like I said, people want to have the choice of taking either one of them or one of each. The slasher is just not going to be worth it, I'm afraid. And they're both height 6, for what that's worth, so they're tall and they can see over things. Let's go to the heroes. Now, there's 2, 4, 6, 8 heroes. I'm not going to talk about them all. There's a Bang Git, a guy who runs around throwing grenades. There's a Sting Git, that's like an assassin that's supposed to hunt characters. I don't think you're going to see either of those because what's the point? I never took Troll Bruisers. I know a lot of people do, but I'm not interested in them. I don't like creatures that just inspire certain things. They're not very versatile. So I'm not going to talk about that. I will talk about the king. No one took kings in the past because kings and a lot of those higher level characters, you're just looking primarily first for an inspiring bubble, right? So you take a flag Git or maybe a big Git. The king sure had more capabilities in combat and stuff, but that's what you're not buying them for that. So no one really took Goblin Kings, at least on foot. To their credit, Mantic has corrected that in Kings of War 3rd edition. And I think a lot of these kind of characters have come down in price. At least the ones that, like vampires maybe, the vampire lords or whatever, may be still expensive, but they had other capabilities besides just inspiring. The king is now just 70 points. He was 90 last edition. He's gone up to 12-14 nerve. Last edition, he was just 11-13 nerve. He has a bow, a short bow, only 18 inches, whereas last edition he had a 24-inch range. But he also has crushing strength 1 now. So that's handy. One of the things that's a new thing throughout the army lists in this edition is that cavalry upgrades are significantly more expensive for characters now. Previously, the king could get a Fleabag mount for 20 points. Now the Fleabag mount costs 35 points, which is a significant price increase. But on the other hand, being mounted and being maneuverable is a huge advantage. So it might be a fair cost adjustment. I think you're going to see a lot of kings on foot because they have the other option now. For 15 points, the king can have, only one king in your army list, can have a pendant that gives him the headstrong aura for 15 points. But he can't be on a Fleabag mount to have it. So I think a lot of people are going to be tempted to have a king on foot with the aura of headstrong behind a line of trolls, maybe some other goblin infantry. That's going to be a pretty common core for troops now, I think. I don't think you'll see them much on flea bags. There are other options, I think, for that. The Big Git. Big Git is similar to last edition. Last edition he was 60 points. He's now 55. You basically now have an option. The King has Crushing Strength 1 and a short bow. The Big Git can have one or the other. Crushing 1 or a short bow. He can also get a mount. This time his horse only costs 25 points instead of 35 because he's less capable. The King has 5 attacks. The Big Git only has 3. The Big Git's still 9/11 nerve. I think he was last edition, so no change there. He can't take the pendant or anything. So, you may see some more of these out there. He's 15 points more than the Flag Git. Flag Git is still 40 points like he used to be. He's still 8/10 nerve. So, is 15 points really worth it for 1 point of extra nerve and maybe a little bit of attack? Probably not if you're just looking for cheap nerve bubbles. But taking a Big Git to get a couple shots with a bow or have Crushing 1 in the back and a point of extra nerve for inspiring, especially because there's a lot of lightning and stuff that's very tall now, will shoot over units to try to snipe characters. I don't think it's a terrible idea to have something a little bit tougher. But I think you're going to see a King and maybe a Flag Git or 2 in most armies. Not so many Big Gits. And that's because ultimately the Flag Git is still a great bargain for what it is. 40 points, inspiring bubble. His horse, if you get him one, still costs 25. Again, that's an upgrade from last edition. But having a mobile inspiring thing is pretty pricey, so that's reasonable. Instead of a King on a horse, which the King is 70 points, the horse is 35. You're looking at 105 points for a King on a horse. I think people may be looking instead at the King on a Chariot, which is pretty much unchanged from the Clash of Kings 19 King on a Chariot. Still 130 points, 13-15 nerve, speed 9, nimble, defense 4, 7 attacks, crushing 1. Oh, that might be an upgrade. He's now crushing 1, thunderous 1. I have to double check. But I'm pretty sure previously he was thunderous 2. So that would be a slight bonus to him. He does, however, have the downgrade of having a short bow now with 18-inch range instead of 24-inch range. But he's nimble and has steady aim. And looking here, yeah, they used to have thunderous 2. So he's crushing 1 and thunderous 1 now. So, a slight improvement. I mean, he's not really there to get into melee so much, or at least that's his primary purpose. He may contribute. The Wizards and Magic in general has changed a little bit. Different options are available now. The Wiz is pretty much the same. 45 points, 9/11 nerve. Lightning Bolt 3 is his base spell. Some armies you can swap that out. You can't with him. He can be on a horse for 25, which again is kind of pricey. You can get Bane Chant for 20, which I think is what you'll see the most of. Hex 2 for 10 points, or Weakness 2 for 15. Those spells were around last edition. I saw a lot of people kind of playing around with the Weakness 2, kind of, the weakness builds. I think you'll still see some people playing around with it. I like Hex as a spell. The problem is there's usually something else I'd rather be casting. I think you're going to see a lot of Bane Chant just to buff melee. I mean, obviously that's what it's for, but Goblins don't have any super killer units. Even the Mincer mobs aren't that devastating. Or I guess the Horde of Cavalry hits pretty hard, but even that needs some assistance. So I have a feeling you're going to see a Flag Git with Loot of Insatiable Darkness, and probably a Wizard with Inspiring Talisman and Bane Chant in most army lists. At least that's what I'm going to have in mind. Just to buff whatever Mincer mob or trolls are going to be getting into combat. And, I do have some notes here on the Troll Bruiser. He used to be 125 points. He's only 110 now, so for those that like it, that's a bonus. On the other hand, he went from Crushing Strength 3 to Crushing Strength 2, which I'm sure those who play with the Troll Bruiser are not going to be happy about. I'm not sure why they would make that change. Having him Crushing 3 is, I don't know, made him fluffier, I guess. He's the Troll Bruiser. He should be, if he's bruising trolls, he should be bigger and tougher than the other trolls. But there it is. You save 15 points, but you lose a Crushing Strength. Oh, I did make notes here. You'll notice as I went through here, the last section of the book is unique units. I didn't mention anything about Grogger. Yeah, the 2019 Clash of Kings had Grogger's Goons and Grogger's Lobber. There may have been something else for Grogger. There's no Grogger stuff in here anymore, which is kind of unfortunate because I thought he was kind of a fun character. They've got kind of the one character from the last edition, Magua and Juiz, or whatever it is, and Cuzlo and Madfall. Now, Cuzlo and Madfall are pretty similar to what they were in Clash of Kings 2019. He gets one extra nerve now. He still has the -1 aura around him, which is actually a little more powerful now because the way the rule book's changed. Dread exists still and reduces an enemy unit's nerve by 1, and Brutal exists and reduces an enemy unit's nerve probably by 1, although I think it can actually be more than 1 now. But they can't stack like they did last edition. You pick one or the other to apply when you're doing a nerve check. Cuzlo and Madfall don't have the actual they don't have the dread rule. They've got their own special unique rule. So it will stack with Brutal, and the Goblin army actually has quite a bit of Brutal in it between the Giants and the Leggets and all the Mincers. So, I guess that's of interest. Some people played around with them. I think they're interesting, but ultimately, for 145 points, I would probably just rather take a unit. I mean, for that price, you can pretty much get a Fleabag Rider regiment. But they're interesting. They also have, they had some spells last edition, or you could take the one spell siphon or whatever. Now they come with Hex 3 and Enthrall, which is the spell that it's Enthrall 5. So for every hit, it's like Reverse Wind Blast. It pulls the unit closer to you. It's supposed to be the sticky tongue of the frog or lizard. I'm not sure which one it is. I think it's a lizard that he rides around on. So it's only got a range of 12 inches. 12-inch range, and Enthrall 5, and for each hit that pulls him an inch closer, it also does a wound to the target. So I guess that's, I don't know, I'm not going to take him much, but I think you'll still see him around. He's interesting. Magua and Juiz, whatever, is I think a little bit more interesting. He's changed quite a bit from last edition, probably because you didn't see him much last edition, and that seems to be a trend, which is good. I mean, that's what Clash of Kings and hopefully edition changes do. They look at what's working, what's not working, and they make tweaks and changes to the things that aren't working and things that may be working too well. So, last edition, he's only 110 points. This edition, he's 150. So that's a significant price increase. But what do you get to that? Well, first of all, he's a large cavalry individual hero. So just like last edition, he's on a bigger base because it's like a Maw Beast and a Wizard Handler dude. He's got 7 attacks now instead of 4. So that's a significant increase. He's got defense 5 instead of defense 4, which is a significant increase. Same nerve, 12-4. He's speed 6 in nimble, like he was before. He has wild charge D3 now, which he didn't have before. He also has duelist, which means he's attacking an individual, he doubles, in melee, I believe, he doubles his number of attacks. So from 7 to 14 attacks hitting on 3s, with Crushing Strength 2 and Vicious, That's pretty significant. That will put the hurt on any character flying in with like the wings of the honey maze or something into your backfield. And because he's an individual, he can pivot and charge on the spot. With wild charge D3, speed 6, nimble, he can get around quite a bit actually. So he let's see, he's got lightning bolt 4, but his vicious doesn't. It only works in melee. It does not work on his lightning bolt. He's inspiring and he's a mighty individual. So if you read the rules now, a lot of individuals, like even the king, the flag gets, enemies can charge and move kind of through them and ignore them as long as they can clear them. So this guy, though, he's tough enough that they can't just plow over him and ignore him for a charge. He can actually block charges and things. He's certainly more appealing to me looking at him now than he was in the past. He hits harder in melee. And really, I mean, previously, he's 110 points for inspiring and lightning 4. I mean, his number of attacks and stuff just wasn't enough to really. I mean, what's the point? What's he accomplishing? I either want something cheaper that's going to inspire, or like an inspiring wizard. I can get a wizard. He's got lightning 3. I can give him an inspiring talisman, and he's 65 points maybe. And he's pretty much accomplishing everything this unit would do. But now with 7 attacks, he might be useful for charging and grounding things in my backfield. And a lot of flyers and things have lost nimble. Fly does not automatically mean nimble. So, a flyer may not want to charge into your backfield and expose a flank to this guy, because 14 attacks, crushing 2, hitting on 3s, vicious and melee. That's not something you're going to be able to just shrug off, so you can countercharge next turn or something. So, I'm still a little on the fence about it, but I think at least people will try him out. I think he's got some potential to be of benefit. So. That's it. I think that's the end of the line. Again, there's a couple other characters, and I didn't talk much about the Winged, but they aren't as interesting to me. I don't think you're going to see them much. People maybe play around with them. They're kind of fun, but ultimately ineffective. But as you can see, going through that, yeah, I think everything you could have done in the past with Goblins, you still can do, whether you want a shooty heavy artillery-based list, a combined arms with some infantry units, some flanking cavalry, and a couple pieces of artillery. And if you want to go kind of what I was drifting towards the end, just flood the field with as many scoring units as possible. Some rabble and trash, some slightly more punchy like trolls. It's all there for you. You just got more options to pick from. And a couple duds like the Goblin Slasher, unfortunately, that I just don't think are gonna cut it. So let me know what you think. Play around with it and give me some feedback. Let me know what I missed, because I'm sure I missed something.